Chengiah, some would say that your life has been one of the rags to riches stories academically, yet you've denied yourself the riches by remaining an adjunct professor, and the pay and privileges remained at these sweatshop levels. Why would you do that?
Well, Richard, it is true that I have come literally from the sugar plantations and had a very difficult life and went to schools that were literally constructed by the community, would not be called schools in the present day situations because they were hardly considered to be schools now or then, but nonetheless they served the purpose. So we had unqualified teachers, but nonetheless we struggled through, and then with great difficulties went through primary school. Secondary school was largely in the evening classes rather than the normal high school that you might think of. So it was totally an inadequate preparation for university. Most of the kids in the village didn't go to universities. They went to factories and went to work on farms and so on. So in that sense, it was an unique privilege for me to have succeeded and finally to have gotten to a university. But before the university that I'm talking about was in a warehouse which the white university considered a privilege to create a non-European section to teach students who were keen to continue studies at this factory warehouse university. So basically, it was that education plus the political education of the social conditions in the country that catapulted me into exile. And when I went into exile, I was offered a scholarship at the University of London, and then, of course, did extremely well there, and won a scholarship to Oxford and Cambridge, Sussex and elsewhere. So yes, it is true that in academics terms, rags to riches. But my political education, both in South Africa, as I was a student leader and was very involved with student politics when I was there, plus the political education in England, particularly with students coming up from London School of Economics and elsewhere. My first experience with Marxism, socialism, Stalinism, fascism indicated to me that the bourgeois upper class education that I was subsequently receiving was in fact preparing me to become part of this crowd that were what I considered later on to be enemies of the people. So I was not inclined to become a part of the system. In other words, I felt no matter how, as soon as I joined the full-time fraternity, that this fraternity of full-time professors, full-time university positions, it would have served me and served my interest. But nonetheless, I would be collaborating with the system because I consider the universities to be the think tanks of the most obnoxious political system that we have created in the world. And I resisted being participant in one form or another of that particular system. And I still hold that position to this day.
In spite of leading an extremely dangerous and challenging student life in South Africa, you then took all of your consciousness and your experiences and you rolled that into participating in every single position available in student government. How did that come about? What formulated those ideas?
Well, at the beginning, I was attracted. There was a great controversy on the campus where there were non-European students, whether we should join the National Union of Students, which really were English-speaking students, and the Afrikaner students then, which were the Dutch students, separated themselves from the English students, and they had an organization called the Afrikaner Studentenbond, and the English one was a National Union of South African Students. These two divisions, the National Union of Students, was a liberal organization which included a large number of figures, very prominent figures such as Alan Paton, whom I respected very much, who wrote the book Try the Beloved Country, and was a liberal of the old English liberal fashion, not the liberals as we understand them today. And so there was a debate on the campus as to whether we should join the National Union of Students. There were several organizations on the campus itself. For example, the Non-European Unity Movement, which said that we should not unite with the white students, that non-Europeans should be united to create policies and overthrow the white regime. Then there was Pan-African students, which argued that only African students should be united and there was no room for any other students. Then there was the African National Congress, the ANC, which was open to all students, and they were in sympathy with the policies of the National Union of Students. So I, coming from literally a backyard, a village, had no political education whatsoever. I mean, we had newspapers, but these newspapers usually dealt with political institutions which had no interest for people like myself because we didn't participate in the political system. And so it reflected no reality for people like myself. So I never understood the political process in the country. I understood that the government was run by Europeans, very little idea of the Afrikaners, which only came on later on. I had no idea of other European communities living within the country. So all we knew that there was a system of apartheid and that whites lived, participated in the country as a whole, and we, the non-whites, that's the Africans, the coloreds, the Indians, were considered to be the non-whites and were treated under a similar law. And within ourselves, the stratification system was clear that the Indians were on the top, the coloreds, which is a mixture, was in between, and the Africans were the lowest strata of within the society. Well, this was informal racism. Formal racism, systematic racism, was the racism of the state, which non-Europeans were on one side. So by and large, this was the position, and students then favored at the Conference of Students to associate with the National Union of Students, which we did. And I must say that the contingent, whenever we had the annual meetings once a year, the contingent from UNNE, University of Natal Non-European Section, which was us, provided the most vociferous objection to the apartheid policies, which was accepted within the framework of the National Union of Students. So we contributed significantly to pushing white liberalism as further as we possibly could. And remember, the students in South Africa really were the backbone subsequently in forming policies within the South African government itself, not and the English when the English were in power, which was the United Party. So we thought we would have indirect influence over them, and indeed we were kind of eroding the apartheid system from within. Not far enough, but there it was. And so the White National Union of Students did give us token positions. For example, I was never the vice president, but an associate vice president. That's the furthest I could have gone on that thing. Of course, the other institution was the World University Service, which I served as the vice president. That's the furthest I could go. We couldn't be presidents. And of course, I could be president of my student union of the university that I belonged to, which I did, and I held all the positions there. So my political consciousness came out of the student politics there, and our association, certainly my association with the National Union of Students, opened up a whole vista of political issues which very few black students would have been available for unless you attended their meetings, and also got to know what was happening in the rest of the world when the average black student couldn't, because he or she didn't attend those meetings. So that is what enabled me to have a broader vision of the world living in an apartheid state.
Few professors anywhere in the world would claim to have gone to study at the finest universities and then go on to so many fields of study, including economics, politics, philosophy, education, sociology, anthropology, law courses, African politics, Latin American politics, international studies, theology, Indian philosophy, English literature, urbanization, and town planning. Can I assume that there's some sort of curiosity that works in your mind that keeps you learning and never saying, I've learned enough and I'm done learning for life?
Well, it's very strange. This is true. Once I got to the University of London, I then, sort of did extremely well, and I was thrilled because the professors I got at Goldsmiths College, which was not London School of Economics, but most of the professors there were the first contingent of professors who had specialized in sociology. And in the 70s, sociology was the hip subject. I mean, apart from economics, it was the subject radical students kind of studied. And so I studied sociology as a major and got some of the professors. And I must tell you, I was amazed and never encountered not only sociologists, but political science and philosophers and so on, and their kind of visionary thinking. I mean, Marx, Engels, Fichte, you name Kant and whatever. And so opened up the mind to several international philosophers and political scientists. So I then was so fascinated with what I was learning, but at the same time, the university was going through a great deal of upheavals in terms of political thinking, in terms of protests, both in London and at Goldsmiths. So I was participating in almost all the political protests that were going in. And of course became aware of international Marxists, the Stalinists, fascism, socialism, Latin American politics, feminism, and so on. I mean, and these attracted me because I was fighting the liberation struggle and also got invited by these people who were engaging in the struggle as a South African who had participated in, and was forced into exile, and I was living in exile. So it became central to the understanding also that dialectics between theory at the university on one hand and practice on the other hand. In other words, I began to see that these things were had to be translated into action. So that then, I was in the middle of this, finishing my course, and an interesting incident took place here. I was doing a 3-year teacher's training course, not a degree, and they wouldn't allow me to do a degree. It felt I didn't have a qualification. When I was told I could do a 4th-year degree at the University of London and take a B.Ed, but in order to do that, I had to get permission from my tutor. So I go up to my tutor and say to him, Mr. So-and-so, I won't mention his name, is it possible for you to give me a recommendation to go and do the 4th-year degree? And he said to me, he says, old chap, you know, I would love to do that, but unfortunately, a degree at the University of London is a very extremely difficult degree, and I don't think Africans are prepared to do this, you know. I'm sorry, but you know what? I said, okay. So then I go to another tutor and tell him, well, look, this is what this tutor said. And so the other tutor happened to be a South African, and he said, you know what, F you, this guy, I will give you a recommendation, and you'll do the 4th year. That was fine, so I was quite happy. I got my recommendation to do the 4th year of degree. In the meantime, I had a colleague of mine who was the president of the WITS SRC in Johannesburg during my Newshouse days, who visited me from Oxford. He was a Rhodes Scholar. And he said to me, man, Rogers, what are you doing here? You're wasting your time. Come on, you've got to be in Oxford. I mean, this is where you should be. And I said, hey, you know, Robin, Oxford is people like you, white Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, Jewish. He was a Jewish friend of mine. You know, he said, I don't want to hear about this rubbish. I'm going to send you the form. So he goes along, he sends me the form, I fill in the form, send it over, and lo and behold, I applied to the best college, which was Balliol. And so they got me for an interview, 20 professors. I've never had I thought I had been grilled by the security police in South Africa, and I was a master of handling them. But I go to these 20 cats sitting down at Oxford. You know, after that grilling, I said, no, there's no way. Anyway, I get a reply a month later saying, unfortunately, you did very well, but, you know, we passed your application, you know, down the road and so on. The short thing is, 2 months later, I get a letter from New College saying that I was accepted to do politics, economics, and philosophy, you know, for the next semester and whatnot. I mean, that was the greatest day of my life. And then I got accepted at Oxford. Then I go back to my people who had given me the fellowship at London, an organization, International University Exchange Fund for political refugees, and they were very kind to say, we would give you a scholarship to complete your studies. And there I ended up at the University of London. So there started my career, and then I was absolutely thrilled, but and then I decided I was going to do a PhD. I met a fellow from who was teaching at Cambridge, who came down to Oxford to visit a friend of mine, and he suggested that I come and I wasn't going to work on South Africa because I didn't want to work under a white South African anymore. He was working on Latin America, and I was very interested in Latin American politics too. So I was earmarked to go to Cambridge to do my PhD there. But in the meantime, I had a tutor, and she seduced me in a way to come and spend a year at Sussex. And so I went to Sussex to do an MA in African politics, and then went up to Cambridge to do a PhD in Latin American politics, which I didn't finish simply because I was then met my wife in between. And when my wife told her parents, she was a nice JAP, that's Jewish American princess, 19-year-old who comes to Sussex on an exchange program, and of course there's a contestation here between whether she attracted me or I attracted her, and that problem hasn't been solved yet, and so we were to marry, and if I had to marry her, the issue was she wasn't going to be supported by a family to go to medical school in Canada, and I had to give up my job, my PhD, and as a committed feminist, had to then go and look for a job so that we could support her to medical school. And then when I was in Canada, I registered for another PhD in theology because I felt if you didn't understand religion, you couldn't really understand the political structure of the world. And so I became what is called subsequently labeled as a intellectual derelict. I mean, I teach a million things in different ways and different places, but from a revolutionary position, and fired from about 6 universities. So that's my life story.
Being brought up in the Indian tradition, the idea of a guru is very central to those concepts. That's one thing that people need to take in order to understand things multidimensionally. So how do you work that into your teaching?
Well, this is in almost every course I taught. Unfortunately for me, I had the privilege of selecting my courses subsequently because they were courses, and I was an adjunct professor, and so mainly in sociology and anthropology, wide range of courses. So I then could teach the courses the way I had framed them, which gave me a great deal of, although one of the professors there subsequently, and I became the head of the African National Congress in Canada. And the ANC at that time had tremendous support, both by the government itself and the Quebec government, and then I also was a board member of the International Defense and Aid Fund. The International Defense and Aid Fund was a political body abroad in England, which provided funding clandestinely for all the political trials that were taking place in South Africa, including the treason trial, which defended Mandela and the rest of them. And my own trial, I didn't realize that at that time. But subsequently, when I came abroad, They needed funding, and Canada was one of the main branches of IDAF, and so I was spending a lot of time trying to raise funds for the International Defense and Aid Fund, and the African National Congress, and the anti-apartheid movement, and every other political group in Montreal that was associated with the liberation, particularly Latin American countries too. And at that stage, I was very surprised when the Simone de Beauvoir Institute, which is the largest and the most well-known institute of feminism and women's studies at Concordia, invited me to become a fellow. I suddenly realized that at that stage there were about 2 of us men fellows when there were about 50 women. And then it ranged to only me. So I suspect I'm the only male fellow there, and there are about 100 female research fellowships. But anyway, that be so, that of course got me engaged in very serious studies with looking at how women and patriarchy has been responsible for the conditions of women who were 2/3 of humanity, but certainly suffered, depending on the class level, the most atrocious crimes, even to this day, particularly in wars. And so my objections were there. I'm sorry, but you rephrase that question. What was the main argument of that question?
Being brought up in the Indian tradition, the concept of a guru.
The guru, yeah. The belief was that any subject matter, if it was not dealt with spiritually, rationally, emotionally, those 3 levels, that failed the test of teaching. I mean, so any subject matter that, and then when I looked at economics, if the economic structure was not looked through the prism eyes of philosophy, political science, and all the other social sciences, then we would not be able to understand fully the applications of economics on human society, because we are dealing with humanity at any point in time. The divide and rule policy that has become part of the educational system was devised by the British, and it then takes knowledge systems, divides them into small subject matters, and these become entities of their own and take life of their own. And henceforth, it is possible for the master race to control a large majority of people in terms of just systematically functioning in a sectorial way. So the guru is somebody who very humbly wants to master the knowledge from a spiritual point of view, and that has been central in my life. I mean, so theology. I mean, I studied Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, the native indigenous peoples, the Mayans, and that my students would tell you, and the evaluations, whether I teach sociology, political science, or urbanization, my evaluations everywhere, you've been, I'm humbled to say, you've been the best professor we've ever had. So there's nothing I could say, and this has been for the last 50 years, and I'm quite satisfied.
You've lived politically as an anarchist and a revolutionary. Seen more times or not in street protests, marches, demonstrations, and hundreds of lectures and these sort of, organizational gatherings on many different continents. Why do you travel all over the place? Why do you do what you do?
Well, you see, I can't differentiate between. I kind of guess it's been a gift to be born on this earth. I mean, and I think that when I get up in the morning and look at the birds and hear the sounds and see the sunshine, the flowers, the trees, I think, what a beautiful world. And I can't imagine the fact that there are people suffering or are made to suffer through a political system, an economic system, and a social structure. And I understand fully imperialism, colonialism, feudalism, the kingship, and all the political, economic, and social structures. Higher education, I think education, meaning penetrating the forces of oppression, indicates to me that this is a beautiful world, gift from heaven, as it were, and that no one has any right to prevent this from every individual in our society. So the class system, the caste system, the structures, the political divisions, the political arrangement is obnoxious. It's unacceptable, and I don't think that, and particularly given the very fortunate position, difficult as it was living in an exile, that anyone in any part of the world, including the United States and Canada, that we should be able to accept this and continue. The gifts I've had, the kindness, the generosity of our people, I accept with full arms. But I am not prepared to have a group of people of superior thinking. I can't tolerate racism, sexism, classism, and I'm out there to object to it and to fight it, as it were. I mean, I think I have a moral responsibility not to speak the spoken word, but walk the walk. And my students will tell you that in Montreal and in this country too, that if they want an extra mark, they must be seen in the demonstration, and I'm in most demonstrations. So I have students coming up to me, Prof, I'm here, reminding me that they are at the demonstrations or whatever it is. So I am, I live what I preach. I mean, I try to. No, I'm not in every demonstration, I hope so. But I think this is why I give lectures. I don't get paid for it. I do it freely and sacrifice most of my time, besides looking after my family, which I'm very dedicated to. I'm a full-time cook. I'm a homemaker. I take care of the house. My wife is a full-time worker. And I make sure that I take care of my kids and take care of the society in which I live. And I've got to repay the society by making sure that anything that smacks of injustice in that society, that I am participating to make sure that justice prevails.
You've had students with you when you're forming the American Women's International, the Pan-African and North American Solidarity Organization, Humanitarian International, and various other community groups. Will you comment on why you had students with you?
Well, I've made sure that whatever I've been teaching after I've been teaching a human rights course, saying to students, look, it's not enough that we've now realized that the last 2 world wars has killed more people than all the other wars before that human rights violation is taking place at an unprecedented level. Therefore, let us very quickly look at where these things are around the world. Therefore, go along and form the Humanitarian International and I would give you an assistance. And some of these organizations lasted for 4 years, 5 years, and some of the students have gone on in different parts of the world to build on. Some of them survived, others were moved along. The American Women's International, I argued, after teaching my courses on feminism and women and globalization and so on, that women somehow should have a political organization of their own in this country, for starters. I don't like sectarianism, but if they need to synthesize and not be controlled by patriarchal thoughts about how political systems should operate, that they should form them. And also, in a part of the thing was to look at women in different parts of the world and to provide them with legal aid. I mean, in other words, we were planning, and the Constitution very clearly would be stating that there should be legal, graduate and undergraduate students in law schools should link up with law schools all over the world to provide women with legal aid in all parts of the world, free legal aid, so that they would be, protected from abuse and so on. So these were some of the ideas I suggested after teaching the course that the students should go, and some of them successfully went along and did some work, and others didn't. So I firmly believe that after the talk, they should walk the walk.
When did you get started with your interest in feminism, and why are you so passionate about it?
Well, it's a long story. I mean, I often, particularly I suspect when I studied theology and realized that the Christian Church and its popeism and that entire, and even before that, the Old Testament, and having 100 wives and what have you not. Not that those kinds of practices don't take place in Africa. They do, but there are matriarchal societies also where seems to be. But in altogether, when I see the repression of men, both institutionally, personally, and as groups, and as collectives, I think the injustices against women historically is unbelievable. Then I also believe that looking at the last hundreds of years of colonialism, that white women have joined white men in supporting colonialism, in which case they have helped to suppress black men, but black women most, because in the stratification level. I've written a paper on this, particularly looking at the stratification system in South Africa. Now, in South Africa, when you look at the stratification system of power, you'll find that on the top there are white men, and then there are white women. Then there are Indian men, Indian women. Then there are colored men, colored women. Then there are African men, African women. So you'll find that the African women suffers a sevenfold repression. So when you look at women's repression in different parts of the world, you'd find that it is more significant than we can ever believe, given the economic conditions that comes out of the World Bank, IMF, and all of these structures altogether. So I think we need to pay very, very special attention to women's issues around the world, not only women's issues in this country, but in other parts of the country, and especially in some ways in the Islamic societies where there seems to be a great question as to the freedom of women.
Comment on Latin America and Africa.
Well, these two countries, unfortunately, more than anything else, very little is known about it in this country. Of course, recently we have learned a little more about Latin America, but both of these countries have been victims of imperialism and colonialism. We find the Spanish have literally the gold, the diamonds. When you look at Montezuma's, the Aztec and the Incas, it is unbelievable the cruelty of Pizarro and Cortez and Columbus, and the expropriation of the gold and the silver from Potosi, from Peru, and other parts of the world that have been taken back to Spain and Portugal and France and England. I don't want to just simply mention that. What I want to say is during that process, what we did to the women in that country, let alone to the men. We need to think about it. It's not complete. It's not complete of what we did to the men and women in this country, the indigenous people. I want to bring that to the mind of our American people. I mean, it shouldn't be forgotten, and I think we need to readdress that question and make sure that something is being done. The similar pattern has gone on in Latin America from certainly 1500, 1600s, when imperialism began to spread itself and export the gold and diamonds, so that the comfort and the same kind of imperialism in Africa. Africa has been, divided and shared amongst, 1913, I think it was 1813, when the conference in Berlin divided Africa amongst the European nations. And the European nations have become wealthy out of African wealth. Certainly today, Africa is still the largest wealth-producing country in the world. Your cell phone won't function if there isn't a particular commodity that comes out of the Congo. So we must realize that we have killed. Blood diamonds will give you some idea, but a very marginal idea as to what the murder and the brutality that is taking place. We've provided them with arms, and that's exactly what we have done. There's a woman called Penny Learnhow who wrote a book in the 60s called In Banks We Trust, and where the banking, the insurance, the cartels, the multinational companies, the World Bank, IMF, and the Pope are sitting together to carve out the wealth. We must understand international finance, international banking, international militarism that is participating in keeping these people in servitude and crime. And the law of karma, unfortunately, I must mention that we do not understand that these crimes will be paid. I mean, in other words, it is not true that we could commit these crimes and live out of their wealth and live happily hereafter. It doesn't work this way. And I think within our Christian tradition, we say, what we sow, we reap. And so I am afraid that the recklessness of the average American, in that we do not understand that we are digging the graves of our grandchildren, that what we are doing today in Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Libya is going to come back. I mean, this is a metaphysical force that we need to understand is going to fully reproduce itself. And so my job, I suspect, and the job of educators and people like yourself who are producing these programs is to awaken our people to say, don't sit in your comfort zone, that our behavior in Africa, Asia, and Latin America is going to come back. We've done enough crime there. Let's examine. And your curriculum, I must say, in history is the most appalling description of some function which doesn't have any reflective knowledge of our history as we understand it and our engagement in the wars that we have engaged in various countries for our interest. And this idea of exceptionalism, or what Tom Wilcott talks about, exceptionalism that we've been wandering around with, must come to an end. And we must move out from that particular center of thought.
Your vast array of courses taught by a professor is amazing. Racism, globalism, women in globalization, aid in the international world, human rights, film criticism, violence, culture, First Nations of the world, a host of new courses. And unlike a normal professor who teaches the same subject year after year, you know, you're doing different things all the time. How do you keep up with all this? How do you get all this new information to keep going forward?
Well, somebody once said there isn't another professor in the world that has done this. I mean, you know, and I was amazed. I said, really? Yes, professors teach one course, two courses, three courses, and that's the end of their expertise. I mean, we are trained to do our PhD in one particular area. You know, it's either physics or chemistry or whatever it is. And I seemed sometime, it is partly because of my being a part-time adjunct professor, and somewhere I haven't mentioned, I've been fired from about 6 universities altogether, and I know that when I go along, I am going to be fired sooner or later from these universities. I mean, so I don't even care. And my teaching is that, and then one of the reasons why I've been teaching these courses is I'm not stuck in one place. I'm sure you've gone through university yourself, where the professor comes along with his notes he made in history, you know, sort of 10 years ago. He comes along and reads this thing away. I'm going to teach a new course. I need to be up to date with the damn course. I need to do the readings for that course, and I love it because I'm now reading something that I've never read, and so therefore I say to myself, I mean, I choose, for example, I was just teaching a course on international violence and looked at the psychology of violence, the politics of violence, the different kinds of violence in different places of the world, and different writers in the question. I mean, it was just incredible. I have had this unique opportunity to educate myself when I'm teaching these new courses that I'm. It's a lot of work, and when you look at my, you know, rate your professors. You know, there's a section on the internet, and people would say, you know, this professor is excellent. He's the best teacher in the school or whatever it is. But you know, he expects too much from us. There's a lot of work. I mean, and few professors give them work every week, and I make sure that I give them essays every week. It's very difficult to mark them and so on, I understand, but therefore I take on this job. My wife says, you know, why are you spending so much time teaching this course and doing all this? I mean, but I love my students. I love teaching, and I love this learning. And it must be crazy, and I think I am crazy.
All right, so while we're in the, I have some other questions, but we're kind of in the education realm. I'll ask this one. So you spend all this time teaching students. You love your students. They love you. Clearly, from the introduction in your book, who's taught you the most? Who has had the biggest impact in your life intellectually for you?
I had a teacher in what we call Class 2, Standard 1 and Standard 2. These are primary school. And he was an extraordinary schoolmaster who told us stories. And the stories really were stories about Indian, not mythological stories, but rather Indian religious stories of the Ramayana and the Bhagavad Gita and so on. And I suspect he was the one that really piqued my interest in the moral issues of life. And these were great battles, but moral issues, worship, prayer. And so I think this primary school teacher could have been the first person to make me realize. And then, of course, also at that primary school, there was reading books and so on with British readers. They too were fascinating reading. We didn't have much books at that stage, but these readers were exciting enough. Then, of course, I mustn't forget, we had a neighbor who he was a worker in a factory, and he used to buy classic comics. In those days, classic comics, I don't know if you know American classic comics, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Yes, I mean, this was fascinating. So, I mean, every time he had a classic comic of Uncle Tom's Cabin and all of these things, that too gave me, I mean, in this little village where there was nothing else, great interest in reading, and that was the kind of literature we were brought up with. Then I think when I did go to university, I had a young man come along and teach. And the fascinating thing about this fellow was he was unlike the South African who came with tie and collar and whatnot. He used to be an open collar, and then he had a pair of pants that were torn and patched. So I one day asked somebody, and he was teaching us English literature. I said, where is this guy from? I mean, this is a white guy, and he doesn't wear a tie, and he's got a patched pair of pants. And they said, well, he comes from England. He's a fellow from Oxford. And I said, what is Oxford? And they said, this is the greatest school for you to go to, But he was fascinating. So I think they were the ones, and of course I had one or two other professors at this university, which really indicated to me that, this is the direction I must go. And then, of course, when I joined the National Union of Students, I met, white students. I mean, they were really exciting to go and travel and further their studies, as opposed to Indian and African students who were really studying to become school teachers, and African students and some Indian students were wanting to become law. That was the sum total of where we could have gone to. So that's, I suspect, would have been the basis to my intellectual intrigue.
You live in West Hartford, Connecticut. you were just like the anti West Hartford, Connecticut. How do you feel? How has that impacted you? Seeing that that's the epitome of consumerism and all that kind of business. I think. Like, describe that dichotomy.
Well, yes, I stay there because my wife and my kids are there, and of course, we came to West Hartford. When we first came here, my wife was given we had both lost our jobs in South Africa. I was fired from 2 universities, one after the other, because I joined the student protests. And this was when Mandela called us back, and we were not supposed to talk about the Afrikaners or whatnot, and there was we were supposed to just follow and become good citizens, which I wasn't. So I lost 2 jobs there. Then I went to Parliament to work as a researcher, and they just disliked me intensely because I was an ex-political prisoner, and these were people who collaborated with the government and so on, who got power, to run the parliament in administrative positions. So I lost that job. I was the only guy who was fired then. My wife was a doctor. She couldn't register, and she taught at McGill, but wasn't recognized by the South African Dental Council because they only had, I think, recognized British qualifications and nowhere else. And so she had joined the medical school but published a book on the apartheid system's medical service. Anyway, so both of us were without a job. Trinity College at Hartford offered her a chair of health and human rights, and they said I was invited as a presidential fellow, and I wrote back and said, what is a presidential fellow? They said presidential fellows were former ambassadors and important political dignitaries, of which I didn't belong to, but then nonetheless they considered me one, and made me the presidential fellow with other diplomats.
Oh, it's a nice audio peak right there. That one's perfect. Whenever you're ready. Okay. Okay, so Chengiah, you got. Tell me about West Hartford. What is your perspective on West Hartford, Connecticut?
Well, it's a static place where I see that the sedimentation of a middle class, there seems to be the normal cultural activity, the kind of mom takes Bobby to the football practices and Susan for ballet and what have you not. A staid class which contributes to the kind of political stability of any nation and provides it the strength to keep the status quo. So in other words, West Hartford is a classic entity for a class society which doesn't rock the boat, as it were. There is nothing revolutionary about the society. The society is happy with 1% owning 90% of the world's wealth. It supports that. It supports us waging war in 3 different continents. It supports our invisible earning of trillions of dollars of our investments in the most fascist nations across the world. It keeps that machinery alive. It makes sure that we support other countries that are so unequal in the distribution of wealth and power. So your West Hartford Society is a classic example of a self-satisfied society which has reached its zenith.
So how does that? How are you not insane?
Well, I live very painfully tolerant, but I must say it is worse than living in South Africa. It's living here has been extremely difficult, but circumstances demand that I live this way because our kids are going to school here, and we have to pay for that schooling. So I'm extremely happy when and then of course my wife lived in exile with me, and I have to be fair that when she said she wants to come back to the United States, this is her country, and so I had to satisfy that request. So, but now I think it's agreed that we go back to South Africa, and she's quite happy with that too. So, West Hartford, I mean, the people are nice, and don't get me wrong. My next door neighbors, we get along very well, and what have you not. But it is no place for any critical thought, no place for anything exciting to take place.
Since you brought up your wife, tell me about your wife, just for the sake of the record. What is her name? What is your wife's name?
Laurel Baldwin. She is. She comes from a conservative Jewish family from Louisville, Kentucky. Why she married me, I don't know. I mean, I can't imagine. I was this bearded hippie, without a job, which I, explained very carefully to her father for her, telling him that he had all the reasons not to allow me to marry his daughter. But I said that it was left to her. So the father was very kind to say, you understand why she shouldn't marry me. But she did, and we did. So, and then they took it ceremoniously.
Conservative Jewish background for Laurel, and yourself grew up Hindi.
Yeah.
Correct? Hindi, pantheon of gods and all of that kind of business. Yeah. Stark contrast with Judaism. Describe that
yes.
balance, that juxtaposition, as it were.
Yes. Well, the fact that I've studied religions of world religion and have taught it, so I understand the mindset that comes from the Judeo-Christian belief systems. And I understand why this very strong monotheistic one God concept and the rigid control that they have, that we are the divine people, we're chosen by God, and all that kind of stuff. Now, to a rational mind, I laugh at it because in the great scheme of things, when I studied the indigenous native peoples' religious belief systems, which is phenomenal, when I studied the Maya and the Incas and the indigenous religious belief systems of the native people in Latin America, or in that part of the world, and the shamanism of the African religious belief systems, the ancient gods and goddesses, and understand the incarnation and reincarnation of the one Spirit of God and the supernatural aspect of the Great Spirit. There is one God, but God manifests himself or herself in multifarious ways in terms of gods and goddesses, in terms of the spirituality and the penetration of that spirituality, in terms of not only human society, but the animal society and the bird society, the society of insects and animals and plants, in terms of each one of it having the spirit, in other words, being alive. So I think well illustrated by Jainism, where the Jains will carry a broom and cover their faces, not to kill the insects when they breathe them, or kill the insects when they trample on them in the street. So sacred is human life and insect life. So the notion that there is one God and one life becomes rather a very narrow notion with those people who all believe that there is one great spirit, but that spirit is manifest in all of us when Christ says, "Know thyself." What Christ really means is know thyself, that you are in it, your life, that life that exists, which goes when you die. You are God, and this is why when we put our hands together and pray to you, or which we do to prayers too, and within the Hindu tradition, is praying to you as God. So we are all gods in a way, and of course we've got to evolve in that spirit. So I can't. So Judaism and the Kabbalah system in Judaism explains that very clearly. So the rabbinical teachings subsequently of both the church, the temple, and whatnot, I mean, these priests have corrupted this to beyond belief. And when you really come down to it, we are all, the same.
And how did you raise your children? How did you decide to raise your children?
Well, within the Judaic tradition, if the children are born, they must become Jews and what have you not. So our children are Jews. My daughter is more inclined to go to India and go into the ashram and so on. I don't force them to follow one religion or the other, and tell them to have equal respect for all religious belief systems. So our son goes to church when he feels like, as long as there's an aspect of spirituality, I am happy. I don't think these kids do enough of it, and that worries me a bit.
In terms of Judaism?
No, in terms of just spirituality.
Okay.
Not Judaism or Christianity or whatever it is. But I think they will follow, and they have been brought up more in the Judaic tradition because they were kids and they had to be sent to Herzliya, which I've had no objections to, as long as they have had some kind of spiritual tradition, although some of these teachings in these schools are much more religious than spiritual, and that's a problem.
Let's go back to your earlier life. Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi. What was his impact?
Well, I kind of guess, there's history and there's history. And I suspect in the process of understanding this, there's a lot of misunderstanding. Gandhi was born in India, and he comes from a particular part of India called Gujarat. Gujarat is to India what New York is to North America. In other words, it is the business center. I'm not sure New York is a business center, but nonetheless, it gives you some indication of that. So his family sent him to England to study law. He studied law in England, came back, he of course at the end, came back to India and wasn't making a successful lawyer. Somehow, the Indian community in South Africa, now, again, one needs to understand a bit of history here. Most of the Indians who were taken in the late 1800s, from 1860 right up to 1800 to the 1900s, they were taken by the British to work on the sugar plantations, indentured laborers, really slaves. My grandparents were a part of that group. But following them to South Africa was a group of entrepreneurs, business people, who had no interest in this, but from India. And they come from Gujarat, the area where Gandhi came from. They opened up businesses, and some of them became immensely wealthy. There was a problem where two businessmen in South Africa were involved in some business transaction, and they required a lawyer. And so one of these business families invited Gandhi to South Africa. Now, to tell you the propensity of capital and the exploitation of the African society by Indians will tell you that the amount that was contested at that time was 40,000 pounds. We're talking about 1890, about that time. That's a lot of money to be accumulated by business. However, Gandhi comes there to defend one of these people, and he remains in South Africa. And then at that time, Indian women, particularly indentured laborers, were really suffering with tremendous amount of indignities by the indentured system, were going on marches, protest marches. At the same time, the British government was imposing sanctions on Indian business, which was encroaching on business, on British business, in the center of Durban, from where I come. So Gandhi then joins with the business community to protest against the British incursions on Indian business areas. Simultaneously, the Indian women, there was passive resistance against the conditions of labor which the Indian indentured laborers were taking place. Gandhi joins them. Much of these women were sent to prison, brutalized, and what have you not. So Gandhi's name as a leader within South Africa came as a result of the hard work that was undertaken by the poor Indian women, particularly of the indentured laborers, which history seems to have not written down. Subsequently, Gandhi formed the Indian National Congress, part of the political movement, and they again became part of the protest movement, which was the earlier protest movement, which then advised the African National Congress, which was founded in 1920, took their model for protest from the Indian National Congress, which was established before them. So it was during this struggle that Gandhi set up his idea of satyagraha, meaning fasting and peaceful protests, and the entire movement about nonviolence began, which he was then famously known for.
So how did that influence you?
How did it influence?
He influenced you?
No, he hasn't influenced me.
Why do you think we left out that business about the poor women, or why do you think history kind of forgot about?
History. I've written about these poor women in several articles subsequently, the indentured laborers and so on, and of course there are.
But history, like mainstream history, I guess, that's Gandhi is champion as.
No. I think there's a revisionist history here that has taken Gandhi, extracted him out of the passive resistance campaign, which was the Indian women and of course men subsequently in which they participated, and made Gandhi a hero in the struggles here. And of course I think his famous thing was he was traveling once in the first class compartment, and there were only whites in the first class compartments, and he was thrown out of a station in Pietermaritzburg, and that was made big history of. And of course there's a very strong Gujarati community in Durban, which really, and of course his granddaughters were in parliament and so on, so they popularized Gandhi there, but of course his movement subsequently in India to bring about the changes in India has been much liked. But I have two objections here, and my objections are as follows. Number one, that non-violence strategies, whilst they hold a philosophical and a spiritual position, is not a philosophy to be followed by any oppressed group. That is counterproductive. And the answer to that is given by another Indian, and this is the very famous Bhagavad Gita, which earlier on in Indian history, there was a battle that was taking place between two sectors of the Indian community, and one was Arjuna, whose kingdom was usurped by his cousins, which sent him into exile. They come back. Arjuna then is forced to undertake a battle against his cousins. Krishna, who is embodiment of God, is a charioteer for Arjuna. When Arjuna refuses to fight his cousins and his father on the other side and his teacher on the other side, there is a whole history there which says, you are fighting soul is immortal. You are not fighting with the intention of killing. You are undertaking this battle to overcome evil. They at this stage represent evil. You are destroying the evil and not their soul, because the soul is immortal. So this episode in Indian history is a classic example of not giving up and saying we want to be non-violent. There is violence by oppressed people, but the violence is not a violence of intention. In other words, we don't have the same intention. Our intention is for freedom, and the violence of the oppressor is to oppress. So
are you saying that
the idea of non-violence as a political philosophy should certainly not be accepted by oppressed people? Ramakrishna, the other saint, says to take a thorn out of your thumb, you need another thorn to take that thorn out. So, of course, we in the West love Martin Luther King and love Gandhi because he talks about nonviolence, and that's okay with us because we are armed to the teeth and we will oppress these people. The day when somebody is armed on the other side and says, no, come guys, if you want to really have a war, we'll take you on. Not with the intention of wanting to oppress you, overcome you, or with any evil. We just want to make sure that we maintain integrity, we maintain the truth. That's a different kind of it's not, it is violence, but with the intention. And in law, my friend Tom Wilcotts will tell you that intention is the main purpose of the action. You judge them by the intention. And the intention of this kind of violence is not with any intention. It is a pure intention of establishing justice. So this is why when people come to me and say, particularly when oppressed people, nonviolence is a good thing for you. No, the oppressor doesn't say nonviolence is a good thing for you. The oppressor oppresses you with the intention of. Do I make myself clear?
Crystal. Crystal.
Okay.
Interesting. Talk to me about the Black American, specifically. First, talk to me about the Black American male first.
Yes.
What?
Yes.
What is your take on him?
Well, he's a tragic figure. A tragic figure in the sense that the identity of this individual, one must understand, comes from a whole history of slavery, and no matter whether he's a judge or whether he works in the factory or whatever it is, there's a tragicness in the Afro-American black person. There is a history of tension, and if one studies psychology, one studies psychotherapy and psychiatry, you'll find that you don't expect the Afro-American here to have a clean mind, as it were, a clean psycho conditions as an average individual. There's a huge problem that he carries with him. Given the fact that he comes along into our society in modern times, he has then said that the social mobility, in spite that the racism in this country is more pernicious than South Africa. And the reason is simply because of the following. In South Africa, you are told you are a nigger, you are black, come through the back door. After a while, you accept that. There's no hard feeling. You come through the back door. You don't get accosted. You don't have anything. You accept that position. You live in your own society, and sometimes there is a skirmish. Your boss is there. You say yes, boss. No, boss. You go along. Here, you are told come through the front door, and there is an art of knowing that this is there's a feeling of racism on the other side. The white doesn't understand that his facial expression, his eyes, his nose, the way he stands and whatever it is, expresses that racism. You're not accepted here. And it is not known very easily. And some of us who have experienced it very quickly, and the whole racism that our society is a shallow racism which we cover by public relations. There's a whole public relations theme. So the Afro-American is a tremendous tragic victim as I see it. Now there's two ways to go. One is to become a victim and you end up in the jails as we are, and there's 60% of our young black males end up being in prison. The other is to become a black Uncle Tom. You then say, well, look, if I want to make progress here, I've just got to accept this. And you become whiter than white. And in my book on whiteism, I describe these characters as tragic people because they will behave in such a way that they will serve the interest of the ruling power at any time. I mean, you've seen them wear black suits, they're dressing. I think there's some party in, when I was in Georgia, I think it's not Tea Party, but they've got a special party where they come to functions with trays and sit down on the ground to watch matches and what have you not, with bow ties and what have you not. There's a particular group. So basically what I'm suggesting that we become, and when we become professors and what have you not, we are trying very hard to please the administration, for example, and I see it at Central, You don't want to make a mistake because you want promotion, you want all this, you are enslaved constantly. So again, this is the tragic figure of the black. And then when we go to other parts of Africa, we are known that you guys, when you come there, you are more, you think you're better than African. I mean, you want to be, come along with this attitude of I'm an American, not an African. And the Africans recognize very quickly, hey, this guy is coming along here and he's pushing his weight along. He's not African, he thinks. He's an American. The Americans think this guy is not American, this is somewhere else. So you have a problem. I mean, then that has to be resolved.
Yeah, so those two choices that you just gave, what is, so what am I to do? What am I to do?
Yeah.
So I guess I must be an Uncle Tom because I'm not in prison, not yet. So, so what does he do? How does he cope?
To fashion an identity. I mean, it's easier for us in Africa. I mean, I'm an exception. I can very quickly go into the Indian community, although I'm a committed Pan-Africanist and spent my life in being a political African and being, in all other aspects, being an African. although culturally I'm an Indian. Although I get shouted down at meetings, you are not an African, you know what I mean, until some guy gets up and says, this guy's done more for Africa, South Africa than you'd ever dream of. But these are exceptions here in the rule. So your question was what do you do?
Yeah, so how does the black man in America go about formulating that identity and that
Yeah. I suspect, do you have a place in the American society? And that answer to that question is extremely difficult. You are going to have competition now with my Latino friends. My Latino friends have come here. They know that they again, because they are much more fairer than you, they want to look down on you. I mean, this is the whole stratification of racism, that everybody who is less white in color will look down upon the one below, and racism functions this way. You want to kick the guy below because you want to become much more closer to the top. This is an idea.
to white.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is when people talk about identity in sociology, there's a question of identity here and how you're going to work that out. Therefore, the Latino community is going to be a challenge because they are becoming larger and larger. Then there is the Asian community, which you're going to deal with because they also want to become part of this American, sort of melting pot. There's no kind of melting pot scenario. We tried that didn't work. Assimilation. Now we have this notion of multiculturalism, and I have written an article on this to see how fraudulent that is, because there is no multiculturalism here when there is very clear what we are. At a social level, we get this thing, you have tea party and everything else, but that's the end of the story, or drinks or whatever. So it's a question that is hidden in the political agenda. When Obama was elected, we were told this is post-racial society.
Yes.
And so this nonsense about Obama representing the Afro-American is fallacious. So this is being whitewashed in a way. And I think this is going to be a problem that we are going to carry along, and we need to open this into a very serious discussion, which will only come about when we are concentrating on the American society, and from time to time, when we should be doing this, we are engaging in not our domestic issues in the United States. We are moving away and engaging in wars abroad, so that the Americans now are united in some sense, and that's what's happening in Israel too. As long as there is an enemy outside, when you go, and as I did in Israel itself, the Israeli society are so disunited by having what they called the Ashkenazi Jew, the Sephardic Jew, and the Jews from Morocco, the Jews from here and there, that the day the Palestinian issue is solved, there's going to be a tremendous internal problem, particularly with Jews that have come from Russia, who are more right-wing Zionist than the Jews who were born in Israel itself. So the question of American racism is a very serious one, and as long as we got wars going on in different parts of the world, this is being put on the side burner, but it's a problem that needs to be debated.
So when you hear, or I guess have you heard, we'll stay with the black man. Just over the course of my life, I've heard black men refer to each other as niggers.
Yeah.
All right, and the argument is, they're not saying nigger, they're saying nigga.
Yeah.
They're taking the A and they're reclaiming the word. What is your take on that? Is he? Let me let you in. What is your take on that?
Yeah.
Where do you stand on that?
Well, the thing is, there is an attempt made to eliminate the word these from the vocabulary of our American society. I mean, it has been derogatory, it's been negative, and we would like it to be eliminated. It doesn't belong to the social, political integrity of our American people. But it is here, and therefore it is very painful because it is again labeling an individual in an inferior status, and it is painful.
So you don't do you buy into the A at the end, making it less vicious? I mean, because
Yes, I know.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. That shouldn't be allowed. I mean, that again, it's no excuse. Although you want to make it any more lighter, I kind of guess we shouldn't have the license to use that term and say that term is then accepted. I mean, I don't think so. I kind of guess the sooner we get rid of the term completely out of our vocabulary, we don't want to label anybody with that label of inferiority.
So how do we make the black guy who just thinks he's just using it as a term of endearment to one of his buddies? How do we make him understand that
that there isn't any special license for this particular subculture to become normative? In other words, subcultural terminology. The same thing with various other things in different parts of the world. The same words using with women. I mean, terms like bitch and all of that.
Absolutely. Same deal. I hear, I heard that a similar argument made by women. Oh, we call each other bitches.
Yeah.
We call each other bitches, but we do it to try to uplift and that kind of business.
Yes.
Same.
This kind of rationality of using negative terminology in terms of endearment is totally against womenization, totally against feminization, totally against that culture of really saying the negative forms that have come into the system mustn't be purged. I don't want to use the word purged because it talks about communism, really. But when is our society going to be looking at words used by one community or another, by one society or another, that gives us the spiritual nature of our being? We can't be satisfying every group of people who come along and think that this is a jolly good term, because the implications for our children and for the society as a whole is not complimentary. So I can understand what you are saying, but we are here not to satisfy groups of people who are fashionistas, as it were. in their particular whatever it is.
Okay. What world event or events have taught you the most about how the world works?
Well, the world works where the 1%.
No, but what event in the world, like, what really nailed it home? Like, wow, like this is what or is there a particular event that made you realize like how bad the world is? You know what I mean?
No.
Have you always been just attuned to the injustices and things like that?
Yeah, I kind of guess the magnitude of the of understanding has come as a result of my my knowledge. Painfully so. Spent a lot of time. Looked at economics, politics, philosophy, and what have you not, and I've seen to what extent this has contributed to the repression of our people, and have looked at the wars, and looked at religion, and looked at the Pope, and looked at the kings, and looked at the various celebrations we have had. And I've seen that the 99% or 90% of the people have been under these conditions for a long time in history.
What's the most important book you've read, and why? Why is it so important?
Politically, I would have thought it is 1984 by George Orwell. That politically, that kind of, but there are so many other texts that I've, which is, there are so many books that I haven't read, and I've Tragedy and Hope or whatever it is that Richard tells me, which is I haven't, although I've been reading for the last 50 years, but it's what I haven't read that frightens me, but. I would recommend anybody to read Shakespeare. And Dickens, of course. Dickens' Hard Times is a classic thing which I recommend to all people. But to an ordinary guy like you, I'd said Tom, what is our favorite writer in law? Appeal.
The Appeal.
John Gresham. Yeah, John Gresham. I think in the legal sense, he'll provide you quite to tell us what is going on.
So, what does liberty mean to you?
What does liberty means to me? It means it's very complicated. I mean, liberty doesn't mean freedom. In terms of freedom, freedom is not an uncharted freedom. The freedom has its limitations. The fundamental human rights. I used to have a lot of arguments with John Humphreys. Now, John Humphreys happens to be one of the three guys who wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. With Mrs. Roosevelt and René Cassin, who is a jurisprudence man from France, and Canadian John Humphreys, an old man who I've got to know who was teaching at McGill during my time, and he and I used to have a lot of arguments because we used to talk on Amnesty International, and I said that document failed. And of course, he thought that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the United Nations really would solve the problem, and I said absolute rubbish. Of course, there is validity there, but that's another argument completely. Liberty means restricted freedom. I can't. I'm free, but I can't take a stick and hit you on your head. You know what I mean? because you have you have your freedom too, but there's a whole duty and obligation and restriction with that freedom.
You spend a lot, or you spent a lot of time in your life, let's just say, talking about a lot of heavy stuff, doing activism and trying to right the wrongs of the world. You know, what do you do to just relax? You know, do you ever take a break mentally? What do you? How do you calm down, or do you calm down? How do you take it easy?
I don't. I haven't got the time. I don't. There's too much other readings to do, or too much replies of things to do. No, seriously. My children always tell me, Dad, you know, you got to retire or do this or that. I'd love to, but I mean, there should be more people on the streets. The demonstrations should be, you know, I published this book, People Protest, and what have you not, you've seen that. You know, I should be on the boat to Gaza at the moment. What am I doing sitting here? I mean, you know, my students are there. One had gone last time. There's another one there at the present moment. Not my student, but a student from Central who is a friend of mine. And we should be actively engaged in. And I feel ashamed I'm not doing that. But I've written an article in my book on the Palestinian issue. I don't know. I am struggling away because some of my friends or my children, well, you know, my daughter does a lot of work, but my son doesn't as much. Because
do you feel guilty?
I feel guilty all the time. Of course. We should be active more than we meet the air. It's true. No, I shall continue for a long time to come, and given me that my health is there. I think more people should be involved, directly involved. I mean, I think this is an action. I don't think this is passive. I mean, you know, I think what Lisa and Richard are doing in their stuff is political. I mean, this is activity, and I don't care what kind of activity you are engaged in, but I think you have to be.
Speaking of, you made reference to students and whatnot over in Gaza. Tell me about Steve Biko. Who was he?
Well, yeah, Steve Biko was a young man like you who came, and I remember when he first arrived as medical students. I had been the president, and no, I hadn't been the president, but I'd been very involved with student affairs. So he came along, and I think this was one of the first years when when I became the president of the student union, and most of the medical students, including Steve Biko, became a member of my student union, and it was during the 60s. So we engaged in a lot of political activities at that time. Steve was a young man. I mean, you know, he was very interested, and I think his brother was arrested once or twice. And so he was a very articulate young man. He participated, not fully, because medical students spend a lot of time doing medicine rather than being active as we were. And I was, of course, I've hardly attended lectures in those days, and that's why for 10 years I got thrown out of the university without a degree. So he was a part of the National Union of Students, and he thought that the National Union of Students didn't do enough, and he started his Black Consciousness movement, which gained a lot of attention, and Black students joined the movement. But of course I had left by that time, I was in exile when his Black consciousness movement started. Of course, I kept in touch with some of them, and then, of course, and then when they was killed by the South African government, his movement, then people began to join the movement and support it very much. But and now I am, again, I have a problem with the word black. I don't think colorism, although I'm writing a book on whiteism, colorism should play any role in the whole socio-political dynamics. That's going to be another issue that I could deal with. But Black consciousness was what really what I would thought of was rather consciousness of the students of the issues in South Africa, of the African people rather than black people as such, because but that's another story, and I think I will take that up later on in my debates with that term, particularly in North America.
Any other thoughts, Chengiah?
I have thoughts which will last from to the night to the morning. And we're going to, no, I suspect that political action of all kinds, challenging the media, and I think Tom and I did the program of looking at the way the media is controlled by the state, controlled by three families who own the media and the conglomerates that is associated. They doublespeak that is going on, sanitizing the information that comes around the world, reinforcing the fascism and Nazism of our present political system, is a bad time for the world, particularly generating from this country, let alone this Europe and the rest of the world. But at the same time, let us say that the alternative is also gaining strength. There's enough blogs that are going along, but I think we mustn't be taken away by twittering and all of these things. And remember the media, and particularly the technology, is being technology that is generated by the military-industrial complex, and they have the monopoly control. And so the question really is to what extent we are going to depend on this solely in challenging the media system of the power structure. I don't know the answer to that, but I kind of guess in the meantime, whatever alternative media there is, I think we should use it to the fullest extent, but not rely completely on that we have got to think of alternative ways. And I believe that the students are an essential part of this social movement that is going to go along in the world, that they should be looked at very seriously at all levels, but also my experience with students in this country is that there is a very low level of understanding. There is some kind of damage that they are tired. They want to come to the school, get their course, and rush to the three jobs they have. And I'm, amazed at the three jobs they have for the reasons. And then, of course, then I'm told, Dad, Prof, I have to buy perfume and I have to buy eyeshadow or whatever it is, and I have to have these three jobs, I can't compete with that because, it seems that the expense account of my average student is so high that they're not full-time workers. I mean, and so if you want to be a serious student, I mean, at Oxford, I was told you go to the library at 8 o'clock in the morning. You go for breakfast, and then you come back. You go back to tutorials. You come back. You go to lunch. You come back at 2 o'clock. You go and make love, and you come back. And at 3, 4 o'clock, you go and play tennis. You come back. 6 o'clock, you go and have dinner. You go back. 8 o'clock, you go and make some more love. You go back, and 10 o'clock you go to the pub, and 12 o'clock you go to bed. I mean, but here, every time a student leaves, he wants to go, I'm going to a job, a job to pay some bills. So I'm worried about this, what effect we're going to have on students here. But look, this is your guys' responsibility. I mean, you young guys here, you say to yourself, what am I going to do? Where do I start? But they need to be really awakened out of that slumber, and Bobby going out to play football and all of this kind of stuff, the West Hartford stuff. I'm not sure how you're going to penetrate that society. But there's a challenge for you guys to take over. But there is a need to completely change the mindset of the United States. I know there is a figure that we want to become the empire. We may become the empire, but boy, the consequences of that is going to be disastrous, both for people who are victims of the empire and the empire itself, as all empires.
That's good. You might have a minute or two left on the tape, but I like how you ended with empires there. So
No, it's very well said.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. So, you make love at 2 in the afternoon and like 6 in the evening, not at night.
Well,
Was it 8? I missed it.
yeah, well, whatever.
tennis was at 6.
Yeah, was it? Okay.
Rowing.
Was at 4.
First thing in the morning, too.
Well, whatever.
Oh, you got to go to the library.
Yeah.
Oh,
Have breakfast.
yeah, I was projecting.
Okay. And Chengiah, I have one heckle, man.
Yeah.
When I asked you about the book, you called me ordinary.